we doing? Pardon the setup here. Not that I've really had a good setup in the past, but I'm staying home today and not in my office or any other special streaming location because we've got some sick babies. So it's just me in a room trying to do this still. And if anything's going on, luckily we got some nap time going on now. So thanks for joining us for session 6 of, or 7 of season 1 of Multiversity 808, playing for Preferred Futures. Today, we're just gonna actually try and see if this green screen thing works. Although I guess it's a white screen, so I'm gonna try to fade into the background. See if this white background is white enough for this thing to work. But let me see here, and then I'm gonna check on my phone over here to see if anybody's tuning in. Because if you are, then I will open the Discord, and there can be some more of an interaction there. Again, if you go to, if you don't have access to the syllabus right now, the easiest way to join the Discord is to go to agilexps.com/play. There's a link there to join the Discord. So actually what I want to talk about before we jump into anything, I was going to kind of continue building out this Minecraft school to prison pipeline project and continue some of the stuff that we had going last time. But I'm going to put this image up right now that is, okay, so here we go, this thing. So this, I just submitted testimony yesterday against this legislation that they're trying to pass, and this has come up very repeatedly. They try to pass this legislation here to ban, well, not to ban midwifery, but to impose licensure, which essentially sabotages the ability of most Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka Oiwi practitioners, and really anybody who's economically not able to afford the licensure process. And so it's put out there as though it's about safety and health and choice, and kind of informed consumer rights kind of thing, but really looking into the history of licensure of midwifery, which is a big area in my overall dissertation research on university as organized crime. So basically the first context of licensure of midwifery happens in the witch hunts in Europe, and that's the way that the medical profession came into existence to begin with. So to this end, I'm actually going to take a look and see if we can find, this is just kind of an impromptu session. Not that the other sessions have not been impromptu, but this, I'm kind of embracing that a little more and saying, let's use this session to, oh, that's what's going on. Okay, me is already the video caption. Okay, so I'm gonna try and find if there's a game that will teach about midwifery. So let's give this a try. Alright, I'll go ahead and So, this is probably like not video games. This is a developer. Midlife game for adults. Midlife game for adults games. So I'm actually looking for a video game. I think I'd like to get into non-video games a lot and do, non-digital games. But I'm trying to see if there's something I can download and play that will teach us. Okay, let's see. Midwife games for adults. Methods of authentic wartime recipes. Maybe I should put, I don't know what this website is. This is weird. First off, let's do Google, not Yahoo. So let's see, this is Boolean code. So we're going to go midwifery. Well, I was thinking to add midwifery or witch hunt, but there's probably way more witch hunt games that have nothing to do with midwifery, so that'll throw off the results. So I'll just say midwifery. I'm going to do midwifery or midwife or birthing and video game. So this tells Google, this is called Boolean code. This tells Google that we're looking for some combination of results that has any one of these, any combination, and video game. And if you put it in quotes, that means video game has to be in there. Call the midwife. That doesn't sound pleasant at all. I guess part of this could be, maybe this is just critical media analysis. So these aren't looking like immediately very positive. Oh, midlife. No, I said midwife. Call the midwife. Recent years, the BBC have become more open to media platforms other than their original television channels so far as becoming advocates of bringing their successful franchises, digital games, adaptations of Doctor Who, blah blah blah, unique opportunity where we were ushered into a darkened conference room where we were greeted by Michael Cummings to show us the latest title he and his team have been working on. Let's see, is there just a trailer? I don't want to read this article. I want to see the trailer. By the way, before I do this, I should tell you, the date for this thing here already passed, right? But, so I submitted testimony, which I can share with you. And I'm possibly going to submit further written testimony, but tomorrow, Thursday, is the next hearing for this, and that's the final decision making. So if you just search in Google 10 SB 1033 Hawaii measure status, this is the one. So it shows you down here the latest hearing notice. There's this hearing happening tomorrow. And if you want to submit testimony for this measure, you can submit testimony if you click here. Of course, in order to inform yourself and not just take my word for it that you should oppose this bill, you can read everybody else's past testimonies already here. You can do your own research. Of course, a lot of the sources that I have linked in this syllabus I think speak to why I am in opposition to it. But here's the session. this was the measure. It was heard yesterday in the Senate. So the House bill, the corresponding House bill, which I believe is HB 490, was already passed. And now this version is in the Senate. So if this passes tomorrow, I believe it becomes a law. And it would, relating to the licensure of midwives, establishes license of midwives, exempts Native Hawaiian healers from licensure requirements, requires registration for current practicing midwives by January 1st, 2024, and thereafter full licensure must be obtained, provides provisional licensure until full licensure can be obtained, provides penalties for violation of registration and licensure requirements, appropriates funds from the Compliance Resolution Fund. As this is a decision-making meeting only, no public testimony will be accepted. That's really, I don't know how that's going to work out. So 10:05 a.m. tomorrow at the Capitol, Hawaii State Capitol, 329. I wonder how that's going to work. Not having further testimony. Well, they better not pass it. There's going to be problems. Oh, darn it. I'm so sorry. I just saw that this was still covering the screen. Here's what I was just reading from. So I got there by just Googling SB 1033 Hawaii. That brought as the top result this one, SB 1033 measure status. And then I go, if you're looking for the most recent hearing on any legislation, just go to this hearing notices piece and then view. And I just held down Control and I clicked that, and that brought it up in a new tab. So let's see this. Call the midwife. So I think actually for today's session I might open up that legislation. Go through it. I'm not sure just yet. Season 8, Episode 2. Wow. Oh. Spectator.
There are between 80 and 100 babies born each month in Poplar.
It's because my headphones are plugged into the wrong jack, so I think you could hear me. And you could probably hear that broadcast, but I couldn't hear it because my things weren't plugged in.
There are between 80 and 100 babies born each month in Poplar. Soon as one vacates its pram, another one takes its place.
22 pregnancies. There's 24 of us altogether.
24. The East End will eat her for breakfast.
Your comfort is not important. You have a job to do, and you will do it.
I can't believe you're a nun now.
I'm not a nun, I'm a nurse. People like you are supposed to help people like me.
There's more to me than work. I've had my share of adventures.
God love your innocence, Nurse Jenny.
I can feel your hand. It's shaking.
We're doing this together. Do you think with me, love? I'm an old hand.
I didn't know people lived like this.
But they do, and it's why we're here. Call the Midwife on BBC One and BBC One HD.
That's really annoying. For some reason, when I have my phone plugged in to my computer, sometimes it keeps doing that. That's what that beeping noise was. Okay, well, I'm not sure how I feel about that show yet. I'll have to actually watch it and see how it all goes down, because right now the current bill that they're trying to pass is not anti-midwife, but it is about policing midwifery and regulation um, in a way that I see is too close to the medical paradigm that's trying to rein it into um, the whole medical system and the medical epistemology and ways of doing things, which, as you will soon see, are rooted in witch hunts. So actually, we're going to go like this. I'm going to show this film. It's called The Burning Times by Donna Reed. I don't need to show it on YouTube because the official National Film Board of Canada has it on their website. So I guess we can. So I'm going to show this film. Then I will be back. Should be able to get this dimensions down properly. Okay, cool. That fits just right. Okay, I'm gonna kill my microphone. To play this, it is just under an hour long. I guess before I play it, I'll show you. Here's the website. So it's The Burning Times by Donna Reed, made in 1990, 56 minutes long, and it's part of a longer series. There's a couple other films that are part of the same series, but we're gonna start with this. So you know why I'm not down with the licensure, and why I think it is another round of witch hunts that are part of the U.S. occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom, or the colonial displacement of original ways of knowing and being, and recreation, and essentially it's part of a genocide in the Hawaiian Islands against the original peoples of this place, Kanaka Maoli, Kanaka Wiwi people, and a lot of other Pacific Island peoples as well, and people who've been displaced from their own homelands elsewhere who are living here. Regardless, this affects everybody. It's not just Native Hawaiians, but I do think it's important to emphasize how it's a genocide against Native Hawaiians, and how it's tied up in that. So I'm gonna pause these other images, and hopefully this will come through well.
For thousands of years, this spring was sacred to the ancient tribes of Britain. Depicted here as a Holy Trinity,
the Celtic goddess Sulis, presided over the spring at Bath. When the Romans arrived in Britain, they dedicated the shrine to Minerva, their goddess of wisdom and good health. Ancient myths describe it as a place of prophecy, as well as healing, for the pools were said to offer up visions. The Romans didn't destroy the religions of the peoples they conquered. They too took the healing waters and dreamed by the hot pools. They too believed that nature was sacred, and the spirit of the earth goddess was alive in all things. Long after Roman times, women continued the ancient traditions of the old religions with 1,000 small ceremonies in their daily lives. They were leaders, counselors, visionaries, and healers. In Europe, their villages knew them as wise women. The Christian church and state branded them witches and condemned them as worshippers of the devil. Their history, once lost, is being reclaimed by a new generation of women.
The understanding of witch, let's say, as healer, or witch as the woman alone, the strong woman, the woman in nature, the woman at the edge of social change, all those meanings that we could think of in regard to witch are not the meanings that most people in our society look at. They see witches in terms of evil, they confuse witch with Satanist, they do all those kind of things.
Our ideas about witches date back to the Renaissance and the period in history known as the witch craze. By the time it was over, women's power had become associated with darkness and death. On Halloween, the witch is queen of the night. We forget that Halloween was once the pagan festival of Samhain, a time to remember the ancestors. Midnight orgies, satanic rites, and human sacrifice. We have been taught to fear the witch, but we are still drawn to her power. Perhaps it's because we remember another time. A time when older women were revered, and the conical hat was a symbol of knowledge. a time when the cauldron symbolized the origins of life and the magical power of women.
I think one of the reasons why people fear the word witch so much is that it brings up ideas about women's power. And for 5,000 years or longer, we have been propagandized really to fear women's power, to fear female power, to see it as something negative, something to be afraid of, something destructive, something evil. And naturally, we have all those associations that come up with the word witch. That's why, for me, it's important to use that word, to bring it up, to say, look, let's bring out into the light all of this stuff. Let's look at it clearly and realize we don't have to fear it.
The word witchcraft has been used to dismiss many cultural traditions, not only in Europe, but around the world. This woman in Brazil is a member of the religion known as the Society of the Alejo. For generations, the women of the Alejo kept alive the traditions of their African ancestors. When the Europeans arrived in Africa and the Americas, women who practiced rituals like these were called heathens and persecuted as witches. We still call these women witch doctors and charlatans. They are the folk healers of Peru, and for centuries they've met in markets like this one. Many of the drugs that stock our pharmacies were first used by female healers. 400 years ago, women like this were burned at the stake for the crime of witchcraft.
Bálsamo divino, bálsamo de sanación.
Margarita Vespuedes is a curandera, a Mexican healing witch. Despite years of persecution, women like Margarita have continued to practice as healers. Modern medicine once dismissed techniques like these, but doctors are beginning to re-examine the healing power of the human spirit.
Sanos, salvos se han de encontrar y sanos y salvos han de quedar. Yo soy de la obra espiritual nombrada por el Eterno Padre para ayudar a todos mis seres hermanos, toda la humanidad, encarnados y desencarnados. Soy piedra fundamental, guía de guías, consejera. El que necesita el consejo, yo le digo cómo debe de caminar, cómo debe de vivir, cómo debe de protegerse con la palabra de Dios nuestro Señor, el niño Jesús.
Like Margarita, many European healers who were burned relied on Christian faith when performing their cures, but their healing arts were rooted in the traditions of their ancestors.
The original word witch, it comes from an Anglo-Saxon root wick, which means to bend or shape consciousness, and thus to bend or shape events in your life. Essentially, it is the remnants in the West of the old shamanic traditions, the traditions of developing within yourself altered states of consciousness without using drugs, without using chemicals, but through meditation and through very, very simple methods like chanting, like singing together.
Everything she touches and everything she touches changes.
Starhawk is a modern witch. She's here with people from all over North America to celebrate the summer solstice. New pagans feel that they are returning to a pre-Christian tradition that honors both women and nature. Starhawk also lectures at this Catholic college in California. Among her colleagues is Dominican Father Matthew Fox.
What strikes me is the vehemence of the letters I received, the hate mail, regarding having a witch on our faculty. I thought that the burning of witches was settled several centuries ago, but people, right, when they sign it, a good Christian, an ecumenical Christian, they'll say, you and your witch friend can burn in hell forever. And it's just amazing what this brings up, that there's a lot of buried material in a lot of Christians' lives.
This cross was erected in Trier, France, in 1132. It was a sign of the times, the symbol of a new religious cult that was sweeping across pagan Europe. Few people realized that the Christianization of Europe resulted in the loss of millions of lives. The Church of Rome set up the Inquisition to enforce its will. People who criticized the Church or held different beliefs were charged with heresy and executed as criminals. In 1554, Marianne Monjou was drowned for calling it the spirits of the Rhine. "For this is barbaric and an obscene right of the people," said Abbot Petrarch. Out of those religious persecutions came the witch hunts. 85% of those killed for the crime of witchcraft were women. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, thousands were burned in squares like this all over Europe.
We're never told this, but this was the women's Holocaust. We did have a women's Holocaust, and this was it. In terms of how many women were burned, it's very hard to get numbers. The high number that people use is 9 million over 300 or more years. So that there were huge, huge numbers of people who were burned and people who were killed by the Inquisition.
They left no written records. They shared no common grave. They took with them their stories, their beliefs, and the traditions of our pagan ancestors. The witch craze involved the destruction of a way of life that had endured for thousands of years. In villages all over feudal Europe, women and men worked side by side. Theirs was a religion of rural life and changing seasons, of oral traditions and beliefs passed on within families. We still call the earth our mother, a memory of the goddess traditions of our pagan past. For generations, people have climbed this hill in England to celebrate the arrival of spring. It's May Day, and the Morris men are waking up the earth with their staves and bells. Once, long ago, the Queen of the May presided over the celebrations. Rituals like this one were part of the religious practices of the majority of people in Europe until at least 1700. They were among the traditions targeted as witchcraft.
What's really important to think about when you think about goddess religions and when you think about pagan religions is that most pagan peoples lived on a particular part of the land. They had ceremonies and traditions and goddesses that were appropriate, and gods that were appropriate to them at a certain time. They made their rituals and their celebrations as things that were important because they were part of life experience. They helped the crops grow, they helped the animals come in, they helped talk about the relationship of the moon and the stars and the planets, and they really didn't have a lot to do with belief. They are based on action, experience, celebration, custom.
With the arrival of Christianity, belief became a way of life. Everywhere in Europe, churches were built over pagan shrines, and goddesses were turned into saints. Before the Christians came, people walked to a remote village in France to worship this Celtic goddess. Even after she was renamed Saint Foy, she was said to dispense healing to thousands of pilgrims, just as all mother goddesses in the past had done. But while the Christian Church allowed for saints, it offered no divine goddess to adore. The newly converted pagans found one of their own and demanded that she be recognized.
There's no question that in the Middle Ages, Mary was understood as a goddess figure. This is explicit in the writings of Mechtilde Magdeburg, a 13th century Beguine laywoman, who in fact ended her life as a nun. Very politically active woman, kept a journal, which we have today. And several times in that journal she calls Mary goddess. And she was attacked by many of the clergy for saying that, but she never took it back. Furthermore, was that within 100 years, over 500 churches the size of cathedrals were constructed all over Europe, like Chartres Cathedral. And every one of them was dedicated to Mary. Now, you have to meditate on the phenomenon of this. You know, what can get a whole civilization, a whole people, to bring together its laborers, its artists, its bishops, its financiers, its architects, everybody to do one thing over a 100-year period.
To this day, Mary still bears the names of her pagan ancestors: Queen of Heaven, Lady of the World, Mother of God.
We can see that there were two kinds of religion. There was the religion of the elite, the formal Catholic Church religion, and then there was the popular religion of the ordinary people, who were by far the overwhelming majority of people in France, and their religion was still full of the old religion, the goddess religion, the nature religion, the religion of spirits.
The most famous visionary of her age was Joan of Arc. In 1429, she led the French to victory over the English after 100 years of war, 2 years later, she was condemned as a heretic and a witch by the same church that would eventually elevate her to sainthood. Prophetic and valiant in battle, the French later wrote of how her presence, goddess-like, had won and inspired them. A magic tree, a hilltop shrine, and a sacred spring in the countryside of France all played a part in Joan's early life. It was here she first heard the voices that would help her lead the French to battle. Joan gave her voices the names of Catholic saints, but her faith was deeply rooted in the old religion. She claimed that her voices gave her an authority greater than that of the church.
And in fact, at the time that she was a girl, it was not unusual for women to take prophetic roles, to be visionary leaders or to be mystics. So she wasn't inventing this. This was part of the background that she grew up in as a possibility for women. And she was relying on individual inspiration, a direct pipeline. That wasn't acceptable. If people could rely on direct pipelines, they wouldn't need the church fathers anymore. They wouldn't need the institutional church. They wouldn't need the whole system of authority that was theological, but was also related to all kinds of other areas of life besides spiritual practice. That was a direct challenge to the most important structures of authority of that time. By Joan's time, the church was increasingly rigid. It was increasingly on the defensive. And it got more and more doctrinaire, more and more concerned to quash dissent, to quash difference. It was more and more threatened by it because of the changes that were taking place in the broader society.
By the 15th century, in villages like this one in France, the old order was changing. For thousands of years, women had been the physicians of the people. They understood the principles of anatomy and nutrition. They birthed babies and held the dying in their arms. Priests fumed as the village wise woman received the honor and gratitude the church claimed for God alone.
The witches, the wise women, the healers were always also the counselors. It's like a whole other tradition of knowledge and learning that has been suppressed because it had political implications.
The Inquisition announced that no one did more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives. They eased the pain of labor, God's punishment for Eve's sin. They interfered with God's will through the use of birth control and abortion. New laws proclaimed that any woman who dared cure without having studied was a witch and must die. Since most women were barred from university, the rise of the male medical profession was guaranteed. Women continued to practice, but now they did so in fear of their lives. It was the testimony of male doctors that sent many to their deaths.
The witch burnings were a way to take control of women's powers of reproduction, which of course includes sexuality, and women's powers over reproduction, which could include midwifery, um, contraception, abortion, women's control of women's bodies, and reproductive issues. This is part of a process of housewifization, of domestication of women that took place over several centuries, but it began in the same period as the witch burnings.
It was a time of social upheaval. As trade expanded, landowners pressed for the confiscation of peasant land. People rebelled as they were driven off their farms and into cities and towns. Those who demanded reform were branded enemies of God. Charges of witchcraft followed hot on the heels of peasant rebellions. Repression increased. Anyone considered helpless, mysterious, or aberrant was victimized, and punishments became public spectacles. Many suffered, but women suffered most of all. Those who spoke out wore the mask of shame. If they gathered in groups, they were plotting against men. Husbands were advised from the pulpit to beat their wives, not in rage, but out of charity for her soul. Those who made a dress too ornate wore the dressmaker's collar. Those who fell asleep in church, the rosary necklace. Others faced the ducking stool.
The mere fact that women are singled out particularly, I think, says something about our society, about our culture, which to a large extent is misogynist. We get it even in the New Testament, in the writings of St. Paul, that it is woman who introduces sin, it is woman who is the temptress. In a sense, it's woman who is the cause of the fall. So there's a very, very strong element of this, both in the New Testament and certainly right throughout the Christian period.
Guilt and sin were now part of every Christian's life. Sexuality was no longer a gift, but the root of all evil, and woman was the obstacle to man's holiness. From every pulpit, celibate priests declared that the end of the world was at hand. The pious would go to heaven, the wicked would burn in hell. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote that next to contemplating God, the greatest pleasure for the blessed ones in heaven would be watching the tortures of the eternally damned. In the 14th century, the end of the world arrived in the form of the Black Plague. It was followed by a series of epidemics that swept across Europe for the next 200 years. The priests said it was God's punishment for sin, but their sacraments did not ease the suffering. People turned to the village wise woman in search of help and comfort.
Peculiar things happened at the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century. Namely, it would seem that the female population increased more rapidly than the male population. Why this was so, it's difficult to ascertain. Possibly extensive war saw the decimation of male numbers. Some have argued that women were more immune to diseases that were rampant at the time, including the plague, so that you would develop this kind of disproportion within the population. Now, the importance of that in a patriarchal society is that women begin to outlive men, and not only that, women, because of their excessive numbers, do not find husbands. They don't marry and become willy-nilly, independent. And in a patriarchal society, this is a very, very difficult thing to come to grips with.
By the 16th century, women's rights to inherit and own property had been eroded. Many women became dependent on charity for survival. Those who held on to their property were objects of suspicion and envy. At a time when life expectancy was 40 years, just being old was suspect. Widows, spinsters, and those who begged for a living were the most vulnerable to charges of witchcraft. They were easy scapegoats for communities plagued by war and disease.
These were centuries of incredible strife, uncertainty, clash between Protestant and Catholic, and most important, a kind of groundswell of anti-clerical feeling. It strikes me that the witch craze is a kind of an answer for institutions which feel threatened. In other words, if one could convince the lower classes that their difficulties arose from the fact that witches were present and were blighting the harvests, were causing barrenness in the marriage bed, what have you, it would sort of take the pressure off the establishment. It's not the state, it's not the Pope, it's not the bishop who is the cause of your anguish. It's the cursed presence of the witches.
She flew through the night air on missions of destruction, and everything she touched turned to death and disease. She was the hag, the devil's agent, the poisoner, the one with the evil eye.
This false image of a witch as an old hag. First of all, the witches were not all old. The women who were burned were not all old. There were some old women. There were a lot of children. It's certainly affected how we look at women today, and it's used as a great put down that women are hags. Hag used to mean sacred knowledge, a woman who had sacred knowledge. Old women used to be revered because they did have this ancient knowledge and sacred knowledge and passed it on to others, so that it was wonderful to be an old woman.
There is evidence that women did meet in groups to participate in the old rituals and to exchange news. But as the witch persecutions reached their height, meetings like these became more and more dangerous. Women who gathered at night were thought to be evil, an idea reinforced by the art and literature of the time.
In the cauldron, boil and bake. I'll add newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blind worm's skin, lizard's leg and house.
It was an age of superstition, and so no one doubted the existence of witches. It was difficult not to believe when thousands were being burned. Historians call it the Renaissance and Reformation, a time of rebirth in art and learning. An age of church reform. It was also the dawn of the scientific revolution. The telescope was invented, and a new world was discovered.
The scientific revolution relied explicitly and heavily
on the techniques of the Inquisition, the techniques of questioning witches in the witch burnings. Francis Bacon, who's one of the fathers of the scientific method and one of the leading exponents of the scientific revolution, talked about how important it was to use the techniques of the Inquisition to tease or torture the secrets out of Mother Earth or Mother Nature.
It was an age that marked the rise of the bureaucratic state and the emergence of capitalism. In cities all over Europe, a new profit ethic was beginning to take hold.
The witch hunts were a business. They were profitable. For each witch trial, there'd be meticulous bookkeeping. Every single step of the witch trial would be costed. There'd be a charge for going and getting the witch and seizing her. There'd be a charge for escorting her. There'd be a charge for locking her up and guarding her. There'd be a charge for someone to bring her meals if she were given meals. There'd be a charge for someone to keep the books of all of these charges. Every single step generated costs, and those costs had to be paid by somebody. If the witch had any property at all, her property would pay those costs. Her assets would be confiscated and seized. She not only had to pay the bills for her own capture, imprisonment, torture, and execution, but there was a whole secondary industry that sprang up around the witch burnings. First, it provided amazing employment opportunities for lawyers, for judges, for people who would sit on the tribunals.
Now anyone could be accused. And the witch hunts were well-organized campaigns. One accusation by a neighbor set the wheels in motion.
When a woman was accused of being a witch and went in front of the Inquisition, she'd be in jail, first of all. She may have been tortured first. Would have been out in the town square or in front of the town church. Because we're not talking about cities. This all happened in rural areas. Most of the witches were in rural areas, almost all of them. So it's a small town thing. Everybody comes out to look. The witch is brought out. She is, first of all, stripped of her clothes because she may have a spell in her clothes or something sewn into the hem, which is made out of the skin of an unbaptized child or something like that. So she's stripped of all her clothes. She's shaved. Both the hair on her head and her pubic hair are shaved because hair has always been thought to have a lot of power. Even we know the myths of Samson and so on. But also that women, when they braided their hair, were thought to braid men's fate with this kind of thing. So it was a magic technique. So she had all her hair removed, but she had to approach the inquisitor walking backwards, so she can't give him the evil eye. And the inquisitor is somebody who is from the city. He's been appointed by the church or in later times by the ruler or whoever was in charge. So this poor rural woman who turns around to face this man that she may never have seen anything like that before in her life, he probably speaks much better French or English or whatever than she does. So the witch approaching the inquisitor is just totally dumbfounded, has no idea what's happening to her.
Many could not withstand the methods of torture used to extract confessions. Enclosure in the Iron Maiden was like being buried alive. Frederick von Spee, a Jesuit priest, disillusioned by what he saw as a confessor to condemned witches, wrote, "Why do you search so diligently for sorcerers? Take the Jesuits, all the religious orders, and torture them. They will confess. If some deny, repeat it a few times. They will confess. Should a few still be obstinate, exorcise them. Shave them. Only keep on torturing, they will give in. Take the canons, the doctors, the bishops of the church. They will all confess."
They were tortured 3 times. The first time, a lot of people got through and didn't confess. By the end of the second time, virtually everybody confessed because the torture was absolutely monstrous. And then we have the question of the third degree. We get that term in English from the fact that this third level of torture would virtually, if they didn't kill the people, everybody confessed.
The torturer made her sit on the rack, undressed her, and applied the thumbscrews. When the thumbscrews were applied to her toes, she cried out louder than before. The inquisitor inserted the mouth pair and demanded that she confess. When it was removed, she told her story. 10 years ago, it happened that the devil came to her in the guise of a man. First they danced, and then they dined, and then she and others knelt before the goat and kissed him. Here she named 8 neighbors. Only one letter, written in 1590 by Rebecca Lemp, survives. O husband, they take me from thee by force. How can God suffer it? My heart is nearly broken. Alas, alas, my poor dear children orphaned. Husband, send me something that I might die, or I must expire under torture. If thou canst not today, do it tomorrow. Write to me directly, R.L. Near the city of Trier, 2 entire villages were exterminated. In another, only 2 people were spared. It took the Church 200 years of terror and death to transform the image of paganism into devil worship and folk culture into heresy. The days when Europeans met under the fairy tree to dance and sing and celebrate the rites of spring were disappearing. The devil was afoot in the land. He was conjured up in fields and forest groves, and his demons were led by women. Pagan celebrations that once affirmed the people's connection to the land gradually took the guise of secular carnivals, and the festivities were led by men. The European world had been turned upside down. The wild-horned god of the old religion had been transformed into the devil, and women were said to be more susceptible to his charms. Women were irrational. They were driven by their passions. If sexuality was a sin, then woman was the greatest sinner of all.
Because women were, by definition, sexual, women were also dangerous. And women could be in league with the devil because, after all of these dangerous and wicked and threatening and ungodly and unchurchly things must have come from the devil. The devil had by then got elevated to God's worthy opponent. There had been changes in church doctrine that made the devil almost the other side of the coin of God.
When a woman reportedly signed a contract with the devil, it was generally finalized with some sexual act. The interesting thing is that whereas witchcraft is found in areas stretching from northern Italy all the way to Scandinavia, women who confess to this, because we still have the trial records, generally indicate that sexual union with the devil is a very, very painful thing. It's never enjoyable. Apparently, the devil's member is icy and frigid. Now, this caused a great deal of consternation. If there wasn't such a thing as witchcraft, how come all these women respond in the same way? And remember, we're in the 16th century. There is no such thing as radio, telephone, TV. These are very, very remote communities and villages. Why do women respond in the same way when they're interrogated? Mind you, it isn't all that mysterious. The interrogators were all supplied with handbooks, the type of questions to pose.
The most popular handbook was the Malleus Maleficiarum, the Hammer Against Witches. It was one of the first books to achieve mass distribution, thanks to the invention of the printing press.
The most nefarious book ever done on how to burn a witch was done by not one but two Dominicans, Malleus Maleficiarum, in the late 15th century. And I've studied the book, and it's unbelievable. Uh, it's a pure study of repression and projection, therefore, and so it's a highly sexual book, and it's all about the projection of men onto others, the fear of their own sexuality, the fear of the night, the fear of the dark, the fear of women. All of it comes out very strong. But that book was extremely influential.
Commissioned by Pope Innocent VIII, the Malleus singled out women as the primary source of witchcraft.
Maybe my lifetime is dedicated to repairing the sins of my fathers. You see.
No monuments have been built to their memory. Only a few relics, like the witch's cart, remain to mark their passing. The people of Trier still gather together in the town square. Few remember the horrors that took place here just 300 years ago. Most people have forgotten that women like this once lived in a state of terror, and that 6 generations of children watched as their mothers burned at the stake. History is written by the winners. We don't remember those who died on Halloween, and fairy tales are the only stories we tell our children about the women once called witches.
I think all day that witches make potions, so you can, so that, and then at night they give it to you, and then they take you to wherever they live, and they put you in a cage and they make you your slaves. I think that there are good witches and bad witches. And I think a bad witch would maybe look a bit old and wrinkly. And I think maybe a good witch would be young and all beautiful. I think a witch is something that comes out of the ground at Halloween and it gives everybody magical powers.
The effects of the burning times are still with us. Every year on October 31st, groups of women all over North America remember those who died. By performing rituals like this one, many women feel they are finding the strength to fight for what they believe.
It's first very difficult to find out what is our own experience, to find our own authority, to find our own voice. And secondly, once we've found it, it's very hard to hang on to it. It's hard to remain true to it. And it's also very scary when we think about what often happens to women when we do find our own voices and we proclaim our own experience and our own truth, and we refuse to tell lies about it and to submit.
Women are once again gathering together. They're looking to the future, a future in which the voices of women will be heard, and the power of women will no longer be feared.
When women get in touch with our own power from within, we find that we do have the ability to do many, many things. And that kind of power is not competitive, it's not hierarchical. If I have the ability to do something, it doesn't mean you don't. For me, part of my commitment to women's spirituality has also been a very active political commitment. You can't go off and meditate and think you're going to affect things that way. You have to act in this world to bring about the changes that you want. So me and also the groups that I work with here have been very much involved in doing political work around the issues of peace and militarism and ecology. Being spiritual doesn't buy you out of doing all the nitty-gritty work that needs to be done.
So, that's that. And what does that have to do with this hearing tomorrow, then? Well, let's pull up this image again. Okay, and then we're going to go to this Ehana. We're going to go to ehanao.blogspot.com, and so right now, the same kind of assault that you saw on traditional birthing practices and traditional medicinal practices in that documentary is what's happening right now with this attempt. So here's our update from Ehanao. As you may have seen, SB 1033 has been scheduled for hearing on Tuesday, February 12th, 2019. And we actually have since then a couple updates, right? So let's see, I don't know what Hanao is, so let's go to vehevehe.org. So Hanao, I'm assuming it's like birthing. Right? Hanao. To give birth, to lay an egg or an offspring, childbirth, productive, fertile. Hanao o hina. He gave birth. Hanao ia o hina. Hina was born. Ili ili hanao. Reproducing pebbles. Right, so there's this same, it's not specific to, it's not an anthropocentric term, I guess you would say. Velohanao, productive or prolific family. Oh, is this, why is this not showing, oh, it's because it's a new window instead of a new tab, my bad. So I went to vehevehe.org, this is where I was reading from. So any Hawaiian terms, olelo Hawaii terms, this is where you want to go. Productive or prolific family, heikeiki hanao, hanao a premature baby, la hanao, birthday, hanao, kamua, ika hua, chicken lays an egg, ho'o hanao, to act as midwife, deliver a baby, or reproduce. So, this hearing is trying to take away the ability and put the control of the processes of birth and life and healing further back into the hands of doctors, which is a profession that was created as a result of political allegiance and not as a result of advancements in medical knowledge. So I'm going to pull up resonance audio, which is so this, I highly recommend checking this out. If you go to resonanceaudiodistro.org, you'll find this here under the December 18, 2017 post. And they have the PDF versions of the zines. I'm showing you this. We won't listen to the whole thing. But this is where you get more of the history, like that Burning Times documentary that we just watched. That gives you a lot of the overview of the witch hunts in Europe. This piece, however, Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, written originally by Barbara Ehrenreich and Deidre English, gives you more of a specific analysis coming from 1970s women's health movement of the rise of the doctor, and it's pretty solid materials. There's people critiquing it. It seems the main critique that people have that I've come across is regarding numbers. People want to debate, say that it's not millions or hundreds of thousands of women that were burned as witches, or people that were burned as witches, but it was several thousand at most. And to me, I'm not actually that interested in the numbers, because regardless of the numbers, we see a transition of the dominant epistemology or ways of knowing about health and life, and you see, regardless of the numbers, with the imposition of licensure and licensure being regulated through the university, you have hegemony, that is a certain domination and control over practices of healing, which I think need to be in control of people. Everybody should have that knowledge, and to impose licensure or credentialing system on it, especially when that credentialing system has financial barriers to it, is a huge problem. So this is what this sounds like.
Midwives, and Nurses: A History of Women Healers by Barbara Ehrenreich and Deidre English. Medicine burned his text on pharmaceuticals, confessing that he, quote, had learned from the sorceress all he knew. A national tour of medical schools, from Harvard right down to the last third-rate commercial schools. Flexner almost single-handedly decided which schools would get the money, and hence survive. For the bigger and better schools, i.e., those which already had enough money to begin to institute the prescribed forms, there was a promise of fat foundation grants. Harvard was one of the lucky winners, and its president could smugly say, in 1907, quote, "Gentlemen, the way to get endowments for medicine is to improve medical education," end quote. As for the smaller, poorer schools, which included most of the sectarian schools and special schools for blacks and women, Flexner did not consider them worth saving. Their options were to close or to remain open and face public denunciation in the report Flexner was preparing. The Flexner Report, published in 1910, was the Foundation's ultimatum to American medicine. In its wake, medical schools closed by the score, including 6 of America's 8 black medical schools and the majority of the irregular schools, which had been a haven for female students. Medicine was established once and for all as a branch of higher learning, accessible only through lengthy and expensive university training. It's certainly true that as medical knowledge grew, lengthier training did become necessary, but Flexner and the foundations had no intention of making such training available to the great mass of lay healers and irregular doctors. Instead, doors were slammed shut to blacks, to the majority of women, and to poor white men. Flexner, in his report, bewailed the fact that many crude boy or jaded clerk had been able to seek medical training. Medicine had become a white male middle-class occupation. But it was more than an occupation. It had become, at last, a profession. To be more precise, one particular group of healers, the regular doctors, was now the medical profession. Their victory was not based on any skills of their own. The run-of-the-mill regular doctor did not suddenly acquire a knowledge of medical science with the publication of the Flexner Report, but he did acquire the mystique of science. So what if his own alma mater had been condemned in the Flexner Report? Wasn't he a member of the AMA, and wasn't it in the forefront of scientific reform? The doctor had become, thanks to the foreign scientists and Eastern foundations, the man of science. Beyond criticism, beyond regulation, very nearly beyond competition.
So we are gonna move on to actually still cover this outline of midwives piece. But before we continue on to that, I'm gonna refer to this book because there's a really important piece here where it talks about medicine becoming a profession. And so on that, I want us to consider a piece by Ivan Illich on disabling professions. And so this is this idea of the development of professions and professionalization, and how that, the kind of the history of that ends up disabling many people in society that are the core knowledges that we should have, that should be very generally distributed. Everybody should have a lot of knowledges, most of the necessary knowledges to be healthy people. And by relegating many of these things that used to be everyday knowledge of people, by relegating them to specific professions, that's made a lot of us basically have disability of knowledge of self and self-care and all of these things. So definitely take a look at this when you can. I just searched Illich, disabling professions, and this came up. So it looks like the debate at UVM. What's UVM? I don't even know what school that is. RVDU. I don't actually often see schools hosting Ivan Illich material, so that's cool. University of Vermont is apparently hosting this article, so that's cool. So before we're going to move on to specifically the outlawing of midwives, that's part of protecting the doctor and the medical profession. And the idea with this regulation that's put forward mostly by ACOG, that's the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, and what's the other one? Anyways, it's essentially about protecting the medical profession and maintaining the dominance of the medical paradigm and of the knowledge and control. It really comes down to not just money. Money is a big part of it, but money is just a mechanism of a control system. So I want us to think about it in terms of that and understanding what's at stake. So the idea of outlawing midwives or of imposing licensure, which is essentially the same thing, because it's not saying that midwifery is illegal. That's not what this bill is doing. It's saying you have to have a license to practice, and if you don't have a license, there's financial and criminal repercussions. So that means that this one group of people, whoever's in charge of policing midwifery and deciding who counts as a legit midwife and who doesn't, or what practices count as legit practices and what don't, anybody who falls outside of that realm is outlawed. So licensure is essentially outlawing of midwifery, as I understand it. So Ivan Illich, disabling professions. We're just going to read the first section of this, and then we're going to jump over back to which is midwives and nurses, to talk about the history of outlawing midwives. So Ivan Illich says, one way to close an age is to give it a name that sticks. I propose that we name the mid-20th century the age of disabling professions, an age when people had problems, experts and solutions, and scientists measured imponderables such as abilities and needs. This age is now at an end, just as the age of energy splurges has ended. The illusions that made both ages possible are increasingly visible to common sense, but no public choice has been made yet. Let's see. Okay, and my mic is on, that's good. The blah blah blah. Social acceptance of the illusion of professional omniscience. Omniscience is like all knowing. And omnipotence, that's all powerful, may result either in compulsory political creeds with their accompanying versions of a new fascism, or in yet another historical emergence of neo-Promethean but essentially ephemeral follies. Informed choice requires that we examine the specific role of the professions in determining who got what from whom and why in this age. To see the present clearly, let us imagine the children who will soon play in the ruins of school buildings, air terminals, and hospitals, in these concrete castles turned cathedrals, built to protect us against ignorance, discomfort, pain, and death. The children of tomorrow will reenact in their play the delusions of our age of professions. As from ancient castles and cathedrals, we reconstruct today the crusades of knights against sin and Turk in the age of faith. Children in their games will mingle the uniquac with which now pollutes our language with archaisms inherited from robber barons and cowboys. I see them addressing each other as chairman and secretary rather than as chief and lord. Even now, some adults have their grace to blush when they slip into managerial pidgin English with terms such as policy making, social planning, and problem solving. Let's see, let me minimize myself a little bit. Okay, I said we were just going to read the beginning of this, but let me see how long this section is because I might. You know what? I think this is actually valuable enough to read through some more of it right now. Okay. The age of professions will be remembered as the time when politics withered, when voters guided by professors entrusted to technocrats the power to legislate needs, renounced the authority to decide who needs what, and suffered monopolistic oligarchies to determine the means by which these needs shall be met. It will be remembered as the age of schooling, when people for 1/3 of their lives had their learning needs prescribed and were trained how to accumulate further needs, and for the other 2/3 became clients of prestigious pushers who managed their habits. It will be remembered as the age when recreational travel meant a packaged gawk at strangers, and intimacy meant following the sexual rules laid down by Masters and Johnson and their kin, when formed opinion was a replay of last night's TV show, and voting the approval of persuaders and salesmen for more of the same. Future students will be as much confused by the supposed difference between capitalist and socialist professional institutions as today's students are by the claimed differences between late Reformation Christian sects. They will discover that the professional librarians, surgeons, or supermarket designers in poor and or socialist countries toward the end of each decade came to keep the same records, used the same tools, built the same spaces, and their colleagues in rich countries had pioneered at the decade's beginning. Archaeologists will label the ages of our lifespan not by postures, but by professional fashions reflected in the mod trends of UN publications. Potsherds, I don't know what potsherds is. Fine. Potsherds. Oh, like a shard of a pot. A broken piece of ceramic material. Especially one found on an archaeological site. So, what's he saying? Archaeologists will label the ages of our lifespan not by potsherds, but by professional fashions reflected in the on trends of UN publications. Ivan Illich gave a lot of talks at the United Nations about the history of society. It would be pretentious to predict in this age when needs were shaped by professional design will be remembered with a smile or with a curse. I do, of course, hope that it will be remembered as the night when father went on a binge, dissipated the family fortune, and obligated the children to start anew. Sadly, and much more probably, it will be remembered as the age when a whole generation's frenzied pursuit of impoverishing wealth rendered all freedoms alienable, and after first turning politics into the organized gripes of welfare recipients, extinguished itself in a benign totalitarianism. I considered such a descent into techno-fascism as unavoidable unless the major thrust of social criticism begins to change from the support of a new or radical professionalism into the endorsement of a patronizing and a skeptical attitude towards the experts, especially when they presume to diagnose and prescribe. As technology is blamed for environmental degradation, the complaint may be turned into a demand that engineers ought to study biology. As long as hospital catastrophes are blamed on the rapacious doctor or the negligent nurse, the question of whether the patient can, in principle, benefit from hospitalization is never raised. If mere capitalist gain is blamed for an economics of inequality, industrial standardization and concentration causing an unequal power structure will be left uncriticized and unchanged. So this piece here, as long as hospital catastrophes are blamed on the rapacious doctor or the negligent nurse, the question of whether the patient can, in principle, benefit from hospitalization is never raised. So that's a core question at work that I think people should really focus on in understanding the implications of this current licensure of midwifery attempt by the colonial state. And also to other midwifery battles generally. What function does it serve to have your idea of health be the hospital? For me, health has to do with what we're doing every day, constantly. And I definitely struggle with keeping that as part of my daily practice. Drinking a fancy smoothie here. But this idea of the hospital, without understanding deeply the history of the hospital, we can't really properly solve the problems of disaster inside of the hospital. So I'll just leave that for now. Only if we understand the way in which dependence on commodities has legitimized wants, coined them urgent and exasperated needs, while simultaneously destroying people's ability to fend for themselves, can the progress into a new dark age be avoided. An age in which masturbatory self-indulgence might be the safest assertion of independence. Only if our culture's market intensity is systematically exposed as the source of its deepest built-in frustrations will we stop the current perversion of research, ecological concern, and the class struggle itself. Presently, these activities are principally in the service of an increased servitude of people to commodities. An increased servitude of people to commodities. The return of an era that fosters participatory politics in which needs are defined by general consent is hampered by an obstacle that is both brittle and unexamined. The role that a new kind of professional elite plays in validating the worldwide religion that promotes impoverishing greed. It is therefore necessary that we clearly understand 1. The nature of professional dominance, 2. The effects of professional establishment, 3. The characteristics of imputed needs, and 4. The illusions which have enslaved us to professional management. So, I'm going to go take care of my baby.
Outlawing the midwives. In state after state, new, tough licensing laws sealed the doctor's monopoly on medical practice. All that was left was to drive out the last holdouts of the old people's medicine, the midwives. In 1910, about 50% of all babies were delivered by midwives. Most were blacks or working class immigrants. It was an intolerable situation to the newly emerging obstetrical specialty. For one thing, every poor woman who went to a midwife was one more case lost to academic teaching and research. America's vast lower class resources of obstetrical teaching material were being wasted on ignorant midwives, besides which poor women were spending an estimated $5 million a year on midwives. $5 million which could have been going to professionals. Publicly, however, the obstetricians launched their attacks on midwives in the name of science and reform. Midwives were ridiculed as hopelessly dirty, ignorant, and incompetent. Specifically, they were held responsible for the prevalence of puerperal sepsis, uterine infections, and neonatal ophthalmia, blindness due to parental infection with gonorrhea. Both conditions were easily preventable by techniques well within the grasp of the least literate midwife: hand washing for puerperal sepsis and eye drops for ophthalmia. So the obvious solution for a truly public-spirited obstetrical profession would have been to make the appropriate preventative techniques known and available to the mass of midwives. This is in fact what happened in England, Germany, and most other European nations. Midwifery was upgraded through training to become an established independent occupation. But the American obstetricians had no real commitment to improved obstetrical care. In fact, a study by a Johns Hopkins professor in 1912 indicated that most American doctors were less competent than midwives. Not only were the doctors themselves unreliable about preventing sepsis and ophthalmia, but they also tended to be too ready to use surgical techniques which endangered mother or child. If anyone, then, deserved a legal monopoly on obstetrical care, it was the midwives, not the MDs. But the doctors had power, the midwives did not. Under intense pressure from the medical profession, state after state passed laws outlawing midwifery and restricting the practice of obstetrics to doctors. For poor and working class women, this actually meant worse or no obstetrical care. For instance, a study of infant mortality rates in Washington showed an increase in infant mortality in the years immediately following the passage of the law forbidding midwifery. For the new male medical profession, the ban on midwives meant one less source of competition. Women had been rooted from their last foothold as independent practitioners. Well, it's now you know, it's everywhere. You say you speak the truth, I say all is fair. Don't send an answer. The Lady with the Lamp. The only remaining occupation for women in health was nursing. Nursing had not always existed as a paid occupation. It had to be invented. In the early 19th century, a nurse was simply a woman who had happened to be nursing someone, a sick child or an aging relative. There were hospitals, and they did employ nurses. But the hospitals of the time served largely as refuges for the dying poor, with only token care provided. Hospital nurses, history has it, were a disreputable lot, prone to drunkenness, prostitution, and thievery, and conditions in the hospital were often scandalous. In the late 1870s, a committee investigating New York's Bellevue Hospital could not find a bar of soap on the premises. If nursing was not exactly an attractive field to women workers, it was a wide-open arena for women reformers. To reform hospital care, you had to reform nursing, and to make nursing acceptable to doctors and to women of good character, it had to be given a completely new image. Florence Nightingale got her change in the battlefront hospitals of the Crimean War. where she replaced the old camp follower nurses with a bevy of disciplined, sober, middle-aged ladies. Dorothea Dix, an American hospital reformer, introduced the new breed of nurses in the Union hospitals of the Civil War. The new nurse, the lady with the lamp, selflessly tending the wounded, caught the popular imagination. Real nursing schools began to appear in England right after the Crimean War, and in the U.S. right after the Civil War. At the same time, the number of hospitals began to increase to keep pace with the needs of medical education. Medical students needed hospitals to train in. Good hospitals, as the doctors were learning, needed good nurses. In fact, the first American nursing schools did their best to recruit actual upper-class women as students. Miss Euphemia Van Rensselaer, of an old aristocratic New York family, graced Bellevue's first class. And at Johns Hopkins, where Isabel Hampton trained nurses in the university hospital, a leading doctor could only complain that, quote, Miss Hampton has been most successful in getting probationers, students, of the upper class. But unfortunately, she selects them altogether for their good looks, and the house staff is by this time in a sad state. End quote. Let us look a little more closely at the women who invented nursing, because, in a very real sense, nursing as we know it today is the product of their oppression as upper-class Victorian women. Dorothea Dix was an heiress of substantial means. Florence Nightingale and Louisa Schuyler, the moving force behind the creation of America's first Nightingale-style nursing school, were genuine aristocrats. They were refugees from the enforced leisure of Victorian ladyhood. Dix and Nightingale did not begin to carve out their reform careers until they were in their 30s, and faced with the prospect of a long useless spinsterhood. They focused their energies on the care of the sick, because this was a natural and acceptable interest for ladies of their class. Nightingale and her immediate disciples left nursing with an indelible stamp of their own class biases. Training emphasized character, not skills. The finished products, the Nightingale nurse, was simply the ideal lady, transplanted from home to the hospital, and absolved of reproductive responsibilities. To the doctor, she brought the wifely virtue of absolute obedience. To the patient, she brought the selfless devotion of a mother. To the lower-level hospital employees, she brought the firm but kindly discipline of a household manager accustomed to dealing with servants. But, despite the glamorous lady with a lamp image, most of nursing work was just low-paid, heavy-duty housework. Before long, most nursing schools were attracting only women from working-class and lower-middle-class homes, whose only other options were factory or clerical work. But the philosophy of nursing education did not change. After all, the educators were still middle and upper-class women. If anything, they toughened their insistence on ladylike character development, and the socialization of nurses became what it has been for most of the 20th century, the imposition of upper-class cultural values on working-class women. For example, until recently, most nursing students were taught such upper-class graces as tea pouring, art appreciation, etc. Practical nurses are still taught to wear girdles, use makeup, and in general mimic the behavior of a better class of women. But the Nightingale nurse was not just the projection of upper-class ladyhood onto the working world. She embodied the very spirit of femininity as defined by sexist Victorian society. She was woman. The inventors of nursing saw it as a natural vocation for women, second only to motherhood. When a group of English nurses proposed that nursing model itself after the medical profession, with exams and licensing, Nightingale responded that, quote, nurses cannot be registered and examined any more than mothers, end quote. Or, as one historian of nursing put it, nearly a century later, quote, woman has an instinctive nurse taught by Mother Nature, end quote. From Whitecaps, The Story of Nursing, by Victor Robinson, M.D. If women were instinctive nurses, they were not, in the Nightingale view, instinctive doctors. She wrote of few female physicians of her time, quote, they have only tried to be men, and they succeeded only in being third-rate men. End quote. Indeed, as the number of nursing students rose in the late 19th century, the number of female medical students began to decline. Woman had found her place in the health system. Just as the feminist movement had not opposed the rise of medical professionalism, it did not challenge nursing as an oppressive female role. In fact, feminists of the late 19th century were themselves beginning to celebrate the nurse mother image of femininity. The American women's movement had given up the struggle for full sexual equality to focus exclusively on the vote, and to get it, they were ready to adopt the most sexist tenets of Victorian ideology. Women need the vote, they argued, not because they are human, but because they are mothers. Quote, "Woman is the mother of the race," gushed Boston feminist Julia Ward Howe. Quote, "The guardian of its helpless infancy, its earliest teacher, its most zealous champion. Woman is also the homemaker. Upon her devolve the details which bless and beautify family life." End quote. And so on in paeans too painful to quote. The women's movement dropped its earlier emphasis on opening up the professions to women. Why forsake motherhood for the petty pursuits of males? And of course, the impetus to attack professionalism itself as inherently sexist and elitist was long since dead. Instead, they turned to professionalizing women's natural functions. Housework was glamorized in the new discipline of domestic science. Motherhood was held out as a vocation requiring much of the same preparation and skill as nursing or teaching. So, while some women were professionalizing women's domestic roles, others were domesticizing professional roles, like nursing, teaching, and, later, social work. For the woman who chose to express her feminine drives outside of the home, these occupations were presented as simple extensions of women's natural domestic role. Conversely, the woman who remained at home was encouraged to see herself as a kind of nurse, teacher, and counselor practicing within the limits of the family. And so the middle-class feminists of the late 1800s dissolved away some of the harsher contradictions of sexism. The doctor needs a nurse. Of course, the women's movement was not in a position to decide on the future of nursing anyway. Only the medical profession was. At first, male doctors were a little skeptical about the new Nightingale nurses, perhaps suspecting that this was just one more feminine attempt to infiltrate medicine. But they were soon won over by the nurses' unflagging obedience. Nightingale was a little obsessive on this point. As she arrived in the Crimea with her newly trained nurses, the doctors at first ignored them all. Nightingale refused to let her women lift a finger to help the thousands of sick and wounded soldiers until the doctors gave an order. Impressed, the doctors finally relented and set the nurses to cleaning up the hospital. To the beleaguered doctors of the 19th century, nursing was a godsend. Here at last was a kind of health worker who did not want to compete with the regulars, did not have a medical doctrine to push, and who seemed to have no other mission in life but to serve. While the average regular doctor was making nurses welcome, the new scientific practitioners of the early 20th century were making them necessary. The new post-Flexner physician was even less likely than his predecessors to stand around and watch the progress of his cures. He diagnosed, he prescribed, he moved on. He could not waste his talents or his expensive academic training in the tedious details of bedside care. For this, he needed a patient, obedient helper, someone who was not above the most menial tasks, in short, a nurse. Healing, in its fullest sense, consists of both curing and caring, doctoring and nursing. The old lay healers of an earlier time had combined both functions, and were valued for both. For example, midwives not only presided at the delivery, but lived in until the new mother was ready to resume care of her children. But with the development of scientific medicine and the modern medical profession, the two functions were split irrevocably. Curing became exclusive province of the doctor. Caring was relegated to the nurse. All credit for the patient's recovery went to the doctor and his quick fix, for only the doctor participated in the mystique of science. The nurse's activities, on the other hand, were barely indistinguishable from those of a servant. She had no power, no magic, and no claim to the credit. Doctoring and nursing arose as complementary functions, and the society which defined nursing as feminine could readily see doctoring as intrinsically masculine. If the nurse was idealized woman, the doctor was idealized man, combining intellect and action, abstract theory and hard-headed pragmatism. The very qualities which fitted woman for nursing barred her from doctoring, and vice versa. Her tenderness and innate spirituality were out of place in the harsh linear world of science. His decisiveness and curiosity made him unfit for long hours of patient nurturing. These stereotypes have proved to be almost unbreakable. Today's leaders of the American Nursing Association may insist that nursing is no longer a feminine vocation, but a neuter profession. They may call for more male nurses to change the image, insist that nursing requires almost as much academic preparation as medicine, and so on. But the drive to professionalize nursing is, at best, a flight from the reality of sexism in the health system. At worst, it is sexist itself, deepening the division among women health workers and bolstering a hierarchy controlled by men. Conclusion. We have our own moment of history to work out, our own struggles. What can we learn from the past that will help us in a women's health movement today? These are some of our conclusions. We have not been passive bystanders in the history of medicine. The present system was born in and shaped by the competition between male and female healers. The medical profession in particular is not just another institution which happens to discriminate against us. It is a fortress designed and erected to exclude us. This means to us that the sexism of the health system is not incidental, not just the reflection of the sexism of society in general or the sexism of individual doctors. It is historically older than medical science itself. It is deep-rooted institutional sexism. Our enemy is not just men or other individual male chauvinism. It is the whole class system which enabled male upper-class healers to win out and which forced us into subservience. Institutional sexism is sustained by a class system which supports male power. There is no historically consistent justification for the exclusion of women from healing roles. Witches were attacked for being pragmatic, empirical, and immoral. But in the 19th century, the rhetoric reversed. Women became too unscientific, delicate, and sentimental. The stereotypes changed to suit male convenience. We don't, and there's nothing in our innate feminine nature to justify our present subservience. Men maintain their power in the health system through their monopoly of scientific knowledge. We are mystified by science, taught to believe that it is hopelessly beyond our grasp. In our frustration, we are sometimes tempted to reject science, rather than to challenge the men who hoard it. But medical science could be a liberating force, giving us real control over our own bodies and power in our lives as health workers. At this point in our history, every effort to take hold of and share medical knowledge is a critical part of the struggle. Know your body courses in literature, self-help projects, counseling, women's free clinics. Professionalism in medicine is nothing more than the institutionalization of a male upper-class monopoly. We must never confuse professionalism with expertise. Expertise is something to work for and to share. professionalism is, by definition, elitist and exclusive, sexist, racist, and classist. In the American past, women who sought formal medical training were too ready to accept the professionalism that went with it. They made their gains in status, but only on the backs of their less privileged sisters, midwives, nurses, and lay healers. Our goal today should never be to open up the exclusive medical profession to women, but to open up medicine to all women. This means that we must begin to break down the distinctions and barriers between women health workers and women consumers. We should build shared concerns, consumers aware of women's needs as workers, workers in touch with women's needs as consumers. Women workers can play a leadership role in collective self-help and teaching projects, and in attacks on health institutions, but they need support and solidarity from a strong women's consumer movement. Our oppression as women health workers today is inextricably linked to our oppression as women. Nursing, our predominant role in the health system, is simply a workplace extension of our roles as wife and mother. The nurse is socialized to believe that rebellion violates not only her professionalism, but her very femininity. This means that the male medical elite has a very special stake in the maintenance of sexism in society at large. Doctors are the bosses in an industry where the workers are primarily women. Sexism in the society at large ensures that the female majority of the health workforce are good workers, docile and passive. Take away sexism, and you take away one of the mainstays of the health hierarchy. What this means to us in practice is that in the health system, there is no way to separate worker organizing from feminist organizing. To reach out to women health workers as workers is to reach out to them as women.
Thank you for listening to this audio zine. For more, go to resonanceaudiodistro.org. Resonance is a proud member of the Channel Zero podcast network. Here's a trailer from one of our sister projects.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.
Witches
Okay, wow, that was that. So there's several points that come up, of course, in watching that, or listening. I want to just kind of do a quick response to one of the things that was said in the end about sexism in the hospital system. This was written at a time when nursing was a more exclusively female profession. Now, of course, there's many more males in the nursing profession, but it would be interesting to do analyze that in terms of colonialism and capitalism, because I know that a lot of male nurses come from cultures and areas that have been very intensely colonized, such as by the United States, such as the Philippines. So, I don't know, just something to consider. I think it would be worth rewriting this zine, or even republishing it with a new introduction or a new foreword that updates the analysis involved and responds to some of the life that this book / zine has had since its initial release. So, considering that, going to, alright, I guess we've been going for a couple hours now, so I'm going to try to wrap this all up and shut down, and then I'll see you next week. But please do consider writing any testimony for the hearing tomorrow. Okay. So I actually put on my blog, go to estelle.wordpress.com. I mean, of course, you know I have this one too, as the Mad Professor. But I don't call myself the Mad Professor to hide my identity. It's Cody Estelle. It's my government name, anyways. So if you go here, I put a blog post up. I'm gonna actually update it with my testimony. I edit it, and I'm gonna add my testimony, and then I'll let you look at that, because I did start going into the details of the bill, and I was gonna write like a detailed one-to-one, line-by-line comment on the existing bill for my testimony, but then I decided that that was actually kind of a waste of time, because there's a more fundamental issue, and that is that the Senate of the fake state of Hawaii does not actually have legitimacy to pass this bill. They've all been put on notice, the entire Hawaii judiciary, that it's Hawaiian Kingdom law and not Hawaii state law or U.S. domestic law that should be governing here. So I'm gonna upload my testimony that I did end up submitting. I accidentally submitted it as HB 1033, and I'm gonna just keep that as it is, and upload it here. So let's see. You can see the testimony I submitted to SB 1033 for yesterday's hearing at the Capitol. And this add media. See, and I'm gonna go to my downloads folder. I just downloaded my testimony, and I can drop my testimony into the folder. Actually, I'm going to change the name on the file so that it does say SB or HB, but in the body of the document it does say HB. But luckily, since I did it through the website and responded directly to SB 1033, they know that it still should be included in the testimony. Let's see. For current measure status, let's see here. There will be a hearing measure status. Here's the measure status. I will link that to the current measure. Let's see here. Link that. Decision making hearing tomorrow. Let's see. Get the hearing notice there as well. Decision making hearing. Unfortunately, they are not accepting further testimony at that, but that seems kind of weird. People should show up. And I guess if there's lots of people there in red, that'll be one thing. Thursday, March 21st, 2019, 10:30 a.m. Let's see what room. Conference room 220. Oh no, this is the wrong. The link's the wrong hearing. Good thing I have double checked that. This is the one I want. March 21st. Oh, 10:05 a.m. Conference room 329. So it is 10:05 a.m. That's the Capitol building. Conference room 329. Is that right? Yep. 415 South Montana. Let's go ahead and add that too. Okay. You can see this testimony I submitted to SB 1033 for yesterday's hearing at the Capitol. Blah, 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 blah. I'll pull that up so you can see it. Current measure status, see here. Okay, let's check that out, make sure it's working. Okay, I'll go ahead and update. Oh, okay. So I wrote, this. I'm writing in strong opposition to this bill. There's a long list of reasons for my opposition, and I started creating a direct response to each line of the bill, and I was going to submit a copy of the bill with comments on it. Here, before I continue, let me make sure that you can access the actual bill if you so choose. So it's right. This is the most recent one at the top, SD2. That's the one that they discussed and passed. So I'll link. I should link that in my post as well. 182 SB 33 SD2. So there's the whole thing if you want to see it. It's there. That's the one that I'm testifying against. Blah blah blah. You can look at it yourself. I did read through it. Not a fan. But there's a more fundamental issue at work here. However, I realized in the process of composing my testimony that doing so might be a huge waste of time and energy. Did I reactivate my mic? I hope so. Okay. It could be useful as an educational activity, and I'm interested in engaging in ongoing detailed discussion with all interested parties about how to address the very legitimate concerns held by those in favor and those in opposition to this bill. As a matter of process, though, it seems that discussing any of the details of this bill would be premature. The Senate does not have the authority to create such a law in this moment without violating international laws of occupation, namely the Hague and Geneva Conventions. I believe you have already all received, directly or otherwise have been made aware of a memorandum from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, United Nations, dated February 25th, 2018, written by Dr. Alfred M. Desaias, which states, quote, as a professor of international law, the former secretary of the UN Human Rights Committee, co-author of book The United Nations Human Rights Committee Case Law, 1977-2008, and currently serving as the UN independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order, I have come to understand that the lawful political status of the Hawaiian Islands is that of a sovereign nation-state in continuity, but a nation-state that is under a strange form of occupation by the United States, resulting from an illegal military occupation and a fraudulent annexation. As such, international laws, the Hague and Geneva Conventions, require that governance and legal matters within the occupied of the Hawaiian Islands must be administered by the application of the laws of the occupied state, in this case the Hawaiian Kingdom, not the domestic laws of the occupier, the United States. So that's the end of the quote. The whole memo is below that I submitted as part of my testimony as well. And I continue. In other words, any legislative action moving this bill forward is against the law if you have not sufficiently answered to the above situation. In case it's not immediately clear why, this is the problem. 1. An official memo from the United Nations that stated that U.S. domestic law is not legitimate here. 2. This bill would create an additional U.S. domestic law in the illegally occupied Hawaiian Islands. Therefore, any discussion of the details of this bill is inappropriate and potentially unlawful. I have included a copy of the memorandum as part of my testimony. I care deeply about this issue and I'm interested in participating in continuing discussions on the matter. My doctoral research relates to the role of midwifery licensure in genocides, and I advise you to not dismiss opposition voices. In addition to the memorandum below, I've included an article titled Americans Are Protected Persons in the Hawaiian Kingdom as a PSA for all engaged in this process. You will find it immediately following the memo from Dr. Alfred M. Desaias. The significance of that article to this process is that regardless of citizenship status, whether Hawaiian Kingdom subject, U.S. citizen of any other country, or a stateless person, the Geneva and Hague Conventions could hold you as a protected person in the face of any war crimes that would take place in the context of policing reproductive choices here following the passage of this bill into law. I have created a space for ongoing public discussion of this matter at padlet.com/Listel/midwifery. Go to Listel, and again here I wrote HB, it's actually SB. But luckily I linked the government website where the bill that I'm talking about is. Let's see, padlet.com/Listel. So nobody's done anything here yet. I will post the video of this archive once I upload it to YouTube. I'll put that on here as my kind of intro discussion piece. Okay, so we're gonna go. No PDF. There it is. Okay, so now here's the memo. Okay, I can finish reading this and then I'm gonna sign off. Please comment wherever you can on any of this. Using that Padlet would probably be the most useful place for engaging with today's episode. Also on the YouTube comments, on my Twitch, email, but definitely submit testimony if you can as well, using the links I've provided. So there's all the to and from, blah blah blah, and I already read this first part, so we'll go on to this part. Based on that understanding, in paragraph 69N of my 2013 report A64284 to the United Nations General Assembly, I recommended that the people of the Hawaiian Islands and other peoples and nations of similar situations be provided access to UN procedures and mechanisms in order to exercise their rights under international law. The adjudication of land transactions in the Hawaiian Islands would likewise be a matter of Hawaiian Kingdom law and international law, not U.S. law. I have reviewed the complaint submitted in 2017 by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, pointing out historical and ongoing plundering of the Hawaiians' lands, particularly of those heirs and descendants with land titles that originate from the distribution of lands under the authority of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Pursuant to the U.S. Supreme Court judgment in the Paquette Habana case, 1900, U.S. courts have to take international law and customary international law into account in property disputes. The state of Hawaii courts should not lend themselves to a flagrant violation of the rights of the land title holders and in consequence of pertinent international norms. Therefore, the courts of the state of Hawaii must not enable or collude in the wrongful taking of private lands. Bearing in mind that the right to property is recognized not only in U.S. law but also in Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt. Respectfully, Dr. Alfred Josias, United Nations Independent Expert for the Promotion of Democratic and Equitable International Order, Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Palais des Nations, Geneva, Switzerland, blah, blah. Okay, so now here's the article that states that this memo and existing international law would actually protect Americans or U.S. citizens. I say U.S. citizens because there's lots of people that are Americans that have nothing to do with the United States, all throughout the Americas, North, South, and Central. So, posted on August 31st, 2018 at the HawaiianKingdom.org/blog. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols from the Court of International Humanitarian Law, which regulates the conduct of armed conflict and seeks to limit its effects. They protect people not taking part in hostilities and those who are no longer doing so. Coverage of the Geneva Conventions also applies to occupied territories, where there is no actual fighting. Amnesty International defines war crimes as, quote, crimes that violate the laws or customs of war defined by the Geneva and Hague Conventions, end quote. Internationally, protected persons is a legal term under international humanitarian law that refers to specific protections afforded to civilians in occupied territory whose rights are protected under the 1949 Geneva Convention 4 and its additional protocol. According to Article 4 of the Geneva Convention, quote, persons protected by the convention are those who, at a given moment and in any manner whatsoever, find themselves, in case of a conflict or occupation, in the hands of a party to the conflict or occupying power of which they are not nationals. Under this definition, civilians who possess the nationality of the occupying state while they reside in the territory of the occupied state are not protected under the Geneva Convention. Article 147 of the Geneva Convention provides a list of grave breaches called war crimes, which would apply to protected persons as defined under Article 4. Grave breaches, so quote, grave breaches to which the preceding article relates shall be those involving any of the following acts, if committed against persons or property protected by the present convention: willful killing, torture, or inhumane human treatment, including biological experiments, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, unlawful deportation or transfer to unlawful confinement of a protected person, compelling a protected person to serve in the forces of the occupying power, or willfully depriving a protected person of the rights of fair and regular trial prescribed in the present convention, taking of hostages and extensive destruction and appropriation of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. The relevant grave breaches and explanations, so end quote, that would apply to the American occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom can be found in paragraphs 190 to 205 of the emergency petition for writ of mandamus filed in federal court in Washington, D.C. If you are a protected person whose situation would fall under one of the explanatory paragraphs in the mandamus, a grave breach or war crime may have been committed against you. So this is where you would want to link that. Take a look there and see. So we're going to keep going. Where did I get 50 years later, however, this definition of a protected persons was expanded to include the citizenry of the occupying state. This was an evolution of international criminal law ushered in by the Appeals Chamber of the International Criminal Tribunal of the former Yugoslavia. The case was the prosecution and conviction of Duško Tadić, I don't speak that language, who was a Bosnian Serb. After being arrested in Germany in 1994, he faced, among other counts, 12 counts of grave breaches in the 1949 Geneva Convention. On May 7, 1997, he was convicted by the trial court on 11 counts, but did not include the counts of grave breaches of the Geneva Convention. Paragraph 608 of its judgment, the trial court found Tadić was not guilty of 11 counts of grave breaches because the civilian victims possessed the same Yugoslavian citizenship as Tadić, who only represented the occupying power in the war. The prosecutors appealed this decision, and it was not only reversed by the appeal chamber of the ICTY, but it also expanded the definition of protected persons in occupied territory under international humanitarian law. In its judgment in 1999, the appeals chamber concluded, quote, "The primary purpose of Article 4 is to ensure the safeguards afforded by the Geneva Convention to those civilians who do not enjoy the diplomatic protection and correlatively are not subject to the allegiance and control of the state in whose hand they may find themselves. In granting its protection, Article 4 intends to look to the substance of relations, not their legal characterization as such." Substance of relations. Hence, even if the circumstances of the case, the perpetrators and the victims were to be regarded as possessing the same nationality, Article 4, Geneva Convention would still be applicable. Yes. This is an important evolution in international criminal law and has a profound impact on the occupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Up until 1999, protected persons in the Hawaiian Islands excluded American citizens. But since 1999, the Tadić case expanded protection to citizens of the occupying state who reside in the territory of an occupied state. The operative word is no longer nationality or citizenship, but rather allegiance that would apply to all persons in an occupied state. This is not to be confused with an oath of allegiance, but rather the law of allegiance that applies over everyone, whether they signed an oath or not. Hawaiian law only requires an oath of allegiance for government employees. Under Hawaiian Kingdom law, there is specific wording that covers allegiance. It is found in the Hawaiian Penal Code under sections 2 and 3 of Chapter 6 for the crime of treason. Quote, "Allegiance is the obedience and fidelity due to the kingdom from those under its protection. An alien, whether his native country be at war or at peace with this kingdom, owes allegiance to this kingdom during his residence therein, and during such residence is capable of committing treason against this kingdom." End quote. By expanding the scope and application of protected persons to American citizens residing in the Hawaiian Kingdom, they, along with all other nationalities of foreign states, as well as Hawaiian subjects, are afforded equal protection under the Geneva Convention and can be considered victims of grave breaches of war or war crimes committed against them by American citizens in violation of the Hague and Geneva Conventions. So that ends that article. So the key things to highlight here is that anybody here right now, regardless of your citizenship, you owe allegiance to the Hawaiian Kingdom under Hawaiian Kingdom law, which the United Nations says is what should be governing here. About the wartime stuff, I think it's important to note that the Hawaiian Kingdom was and is a neutral territory. So it's not to be participating in one way or another in any kind of war, which kind of says a lot to the history of the invasion being turned into Pearl Harbor and all those military bases. Kind of brings up a lot of questions about what would today look like if it was never invaded, if the neutrality of the kingdom as a sort of haven was maintained. But more to the point of this midwifery stuff, I'll just end on this note that my argument in my testimony is saying that they should not even pass this law because they're not supposed to be passing laws at all. They're supposed to be looking at how to administer the Hawaiian Kingdom law and work toward deoccupation. That's what U.S. Representatives anybody that's part of U.S. domestic law is supposed to be doing here now. So the whole Hawaii state, Hawaii as the 50th state of the United States, they're not supposed to be making any more state laws, and they're supposed to be administering Hawaiian Kingdom law. And where I'm saying the war crimes thing comes up is if they're imposing licensure on midwifery that comes with certain penalties, then I think that's guaranteed recipe for further war crimes are going to happen in that context, because this indicates a policing function similar to past witch hunts. And for me, I'm not using witch hunt to be hyperbolic. I think this is actually in contrast to how some people want to use witch hunt. This is actually very much a witch hunt. It's directly rooted in historical witch hunts and shows continuity with Sylvia Federici's thesis in Caliban and the Witch, that every time capitalism is in crisis and new lands are required, they have witch hunts. And my baby just woke up. So check it out. Peace. I'll see you next week.